Hi everyone, this is from a recent talk where I simplified the lipid energy model and how it can explain high LDL cholesterol for lean mass hyperresponders, particularly from a traffic jam analogy. It's meant more for a lay audience, but for a deeper dive, you can check out our lipid energy model paper. Enjoy. What might explain the lean mass hyperresponder triad? Well, this is the one section where I'm going to talk a tiny bit of biochemistry, but don't worry. I'm going to keep it laser focused on those key elements. This is, of course, the boat, what's known as a lipoprotein, and it's a vehicle for transporting lipids in the blood. And in particular, we're interested in very low density lipoproteins, VLDL, which precedes LDL. And it comes from the liver, and it's rich in triglycerides, typically triglycerides that were assembled from fat you got from around the body. Triglycerides are the storage form of fat. So you have this boat, it's packed full of lipids, both triglycerides and cholesterol, but also fat-soluble vitamins and many other things that your body uses. And the lipid energy model, it centers on this high turnover of triglyceride-rich lipoproteins. So they're all packed tightly with all of these triglycerides. And with this VLDL turnover, we have three things I want to draw your attention to. And it's three things among many, but these three are the most important. First, the VLDL that's rich in triglycerides, it's going to turn into a triglyceride-poor LDL. Why is it doing that? Why is it going from something large to something small? Well, it's because it's dropping off its cargo. It's dropping off those triglycerides into the cell. And through some different enzymatic activities, this gets accomplished. There's something else that's kind of important that probably most of you don't know about, which is that there's a fleet of HDL particles nearby that are small, and they actually pick up a number of the components that come off of this process. So it can be a little bit messy. Yes, there can actually be, as the VLDL is shrinking and it's dropping off those pieces, the pieces that can get picked up from small HDL can ultimately result in large HDL. That's kind of how I like to describe it now for lay people, which is that you could think of ApoB lipoproteins like our VLDLs. Their job is to start large and get small, whereas the job for HDL is to start small and get large, but they can only do it through this process. And this helps explain lean mass hyperresponders because more secretion and turnover of VLDL into LDL could result in higher LDL concentration. You're mobilizing more of these triglycerides into the bloodstream. But because of this turnover of these ApoB lipoproteins, it's liberating more of these components to be picked up by HDL, and that could explain the higher HDL cholesterol. And intrinsic to this, when you're metabolically healthy, the lower triglycerides are going to result from this increased turnover. That can explain the lower triglycerides and why this triad seems to be so ubiquitous across all these different populations, all these ages, all these ethnicities. But why would those who are specifically leaner and more metabolically healthy have the highest likelihood of exhibiting this lean mass hyperresponder profile? Well, for that, I want to talk to you about large fat cells and traffic jams. This is a freeway, probably not the freeway that's outside us right now, but yes, this is one kind of freeway, Freeway A, and now we've got Freeway B. And I want you to pretend that you're a truck driver, and I'm telling you, trucks are so dangerous. There's been so many studies that show how bad trucks are. And then you look at those studies and you find that they're only ever on freeways like Freeway B. Do you think that might be a problem for the science? I think so. And with that in mind, let's talk about the major exit ramp. So, this study called Fat Cell Size, and it gets into the measurement methods, pathophysiological origins, and relationships between metabolic dysregulations. Never mind the mumbo jumbo. It's looking at adipocytes, that's our fat cells. And when they get more and more engorged and larger, they become dysfunctional. And as they become dysfunctional, they can also even die. And often you'll find more and more macrophages, which are immune cells, are attending to them. And sure enough, this has a lot of associations with what they call dysmetabolism, or lipid dysmetabolism, which I would call just dysfunctional lipid metabolism, and its association with cardiovascular disease, which, don't worry, we'll unpack that in a moment. But note from this paper, from figure 6, as especially visceral fat cells, those visceral fat, of course, is around the midsection especially, but it's a special ectopic fat that as the population of those adipocytes are larger, they tend to associate with greater fasting insulin, HOMA-IR, and fasting glucose. That probably doesn't surprise you. But likewise, they tend to associate with a lower and lower level of HDL cholesterol and higher triglycerides, and also increasing LDL cholesterol. And that's why it kind of makes sense to me as to why you would see all of these go in a collinear order, why it's important to look at them all separately in that fashion if looking at them together as to why they would be together. So now I want to go back. I want to go back to this aspect of the lipid energy model, and I want to backtrack and say, what if this cell surface was accepting less and less triglyceride delivery? And because of that, therefore, there's going to be less of the conversion of triglyceride-rich VLDL into triglyceride-poor LDL. And then, correspondingly, if there's less of that activity of the turnover, that means that small HDL particles are going to less and less convert to large HDL particles. Well, I know all the doctors in the room would know why I would circle this over here, right? If you've got a higher association of triglyceride-rich VLDL, small HDL, and thus less HDL cholesterol, that's extremely relevant because we might just be looking at a traffic jam in the simplest terms. So here's my picture way of trying to describe it. Metabolically healthy, I'm not surprised if you take a blood test and you see that they've got low triglycerides and low glucose. Whereas somebody who's metabolically challenged and they've got worse fuel flux, that they might actually be seeing a lot more triglycerides and glucose. Does that mean triglycerides and glucose are in fact the cause? Well, I'm very interested in what's ahead and what's causing that traffic jam. But importantly, a key difference here is to bear in mind that VLDL are carrying these triglycerides, so they're also seeing the vehicles that are transporting it. That's very relevant when you're looking at ApoB, if ApoB is part of that larger lineage of both VLDL and LDL. So, now I have to ask an extremely rhetorical question. Why wouldn't delivery failure by lipoproteins be relevant for the diseases they are associated with? I hope that lingers, because that's an important point that I would love everybody, layperson to lipidologist alike, to keep in close consideration. Atherogenic dyslipidemia, it's been around for decades. And yes, it's a typical feature of obesity, metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes. Atherogenic dyslipidemia is this combination. If you have low HDL cholesterol and high triglycerides, it's very likely you will have a preponderance of small, dense LDL particles.